So now with all these improvements out of the way, let's come back to making our app more responsive, especially here in landscape mode. This modal now works and looks better than it did before, but I also mentioned before already that we might want to move the amount input here into the same row as the title input, and then this drop-down button into the same row as the date picker. And we could do this inside of new expense start by again using the media query, just as we did it in expenses start. There we also took a look at the media query to render a different UI based on the available width. We could replicate this approach here in new expense, and it would be a fine way of solving this problem, but I'll actually go for a different solution. Because besides media query, Flutter also gives you a specific widget you can use for building a UI, a layout, that automatically adjusts to the available space. And for that here, in new expense Dart in the build method, I will actually return a different widget instead of the sized box. I'll return the LayoutBuilder widget, which is built into Flutter. And LayoutBuilder is a widget that takes a builder parameter, which actually wants a function as an argument, a function which will automatically get the context object and a constraints object. So therefore here, I'll register an anonymous function where I get this context and this constraints object. And it's now inside of this function where we should return this sized box and this entire widget tree. So I'll cut it here and return it here inside of this function which we passed to the builder parameter of LayoutBuilder. Here we go. With that, if you save this and force a reload, you will see that nothing changed. If I open this modal, it looks and works as it did before. But now inside of this function here, which we passed to the builder parameter, we got access to this constraints object. And if we print this constraints object, or to be precise, some of its properties, we can see what's inside of that constraints object. Because this constraints object is all about telling us which constraints are applied by the parent widget in which we use this widget here. So the parent widget of the new expense widget. And this constraints object tells us the minimum amount of width we can use and the maximum amount of width we can use, and then the same for the height, min height and max height. So if I save this and reload, you will see that as I open this modal and I open that debug console, I see the values here. And here I actually only have 3 values because for min and max width, it's the same value. I have that fixed width without any choice. Now, how can these values be helpful? Well, with them, you know exactly how much space you have available, and you can then decide which layout should be rendered. And this, for example, allows you to build a widget that can be used anywhere in your widget tree, and it does not care about the available width or height of the screen. It does not care about the screen orientation, but it only cares how much width and height is available to this specific widget here. Now, of course, here for this new expense widget, since it is inside of that modal, it is essentially the screen dimensions that are available to us here. It's the width and height of the screen essentially. So therefore we could also just use media query, which does give us the screen width and height. But we could now also use the new expense widget anywhere else in our widget tree, and it would only care about the constraints set by the parent widget. It would not care about the available screen width or height. And we can then use this information here to dynamically change our layout. So for example here, we could store the maximum amount of width that we can use in a width variable, and now use that variable just as we used a variable here in expenses.dart to render a different combination of widgets based on the available width. And LayoutBuilder will call this builder function again whenever the constraints change. So if the widget gets moved somewhere else, or if we, for example, change the device orientation. So therefore this will be updated if the available min and max width values change. And now we can use this width information in this column here, in this sized box, to render the content of the column, the widgets in that column, so the rows of that column, conditionally. And we can do this by using a special syntax offered by Dart that can be used in lists like this, where you write if, and then your condition, for example, that the available width is greater or equal than 600. And then in the next line, you add the item to the list that should be added if this condition is met. So in this case, for example, a row, so that we can have multiple widgets next to each other in this column. And you can also add an else statement to define which widget should otherwise be added to this list. So this is a list-specific if-else syntax where you don't have curly braces, but instead just if with your condition, and then the widget that is added to the list if the condition is met, and else the widget if the condition is not met. So with that, we are adding a row with multiple widgets if we have enough space, and otherwise we only have a single text field in that first column row here. Now, if I do have enough space for multiple child widgets in the first column row, I still want to render my text field here, so I'll copy and paste that. And we could outsource it into a separate widget to reuse some logic instead of copy and pasting it here. But for the moment, I'm fine with copy and pasting to simply show you this general idea of using LayoutBuilder to build dynamic layouts. And therefore then here in this row, after this title text field, we could add a sized box that adds some width as spacing before we then add our amount widget, which is this text field. And this is wrapped in an expanded widget because text fields are actually widgets that are also unconstrained regarding their width, as is the row. And as you learned before, if you have an unconstrained widget inside of another unconstrained widget, you would face problems. That's why we should actually keep this expanded widget here, since we're again in a row, and then add it here. And actually also add expanded here for this first text field, since this would otherwise also cause us problems. So with that, we have this row with the title text field, some spacing, and the amount text field if we have enough space. And otherwise, if that's not the case, we just have the title text field in the first row. Therefore here, if I save that and force a reload, for example, you will see that now title and amount are next to each other. The styling is a bit off, but we'll fix this soon. But they are in the same row. And on the other hand, if I rotate this, you see that they are still in different rows. So that's how you can build different layouts for different device sizes. Of course, we still need to fix some things here, because right now I have 2 amount fields here, for example, and the styling also is a bit off. Now regarding the styling, we can go to this row here and add some cross-axis alignment here, which in case of a row is the vertical alignment, and set this to cross-axis alignment start to make sure that all the inputs in the first row get pushed to the top, so that this now looks better. And of course, we also want to rearrange the second row here and get rid of that amount and instead move the drop-down button here if we have enough width. So therefore, we can go back to our widget tree here. And after this first row here with this if statement where we render the row or the title text field, we can go to the next row and render this entire row conditionally and check if width is greater or equal than 600. And if it is, I want to render a row that contains my leisure dropdown and the date picker. And if it's not, I want to render this row, which contains the amount controller and so on. So therefore this here is my else case. But now we also need to define the layout that should be rendered if there is enough width. And for that here, we then want to take this drop-down button. So copy that. And again, you could outsource it into a separate widget, and arguably that might be preferable. But here I'll just copy it. And then add a sized box maybe again for some spacing, before we then add the date picker. So here we can now grab this date picker, which is wrapped by this expanded widget since it is inside of a row, and paste this here after this sized box. So with that, I now also have my row that should be rendered if we have enough space. So if we save this and force a restart, we indeed do have to drop down next to the date picker here. Of course, we also still have to drop down here, and therefore, of course, we'll have to fix this and get rid of it if we do have enough width available. So therefore, if we go down here to this row, where the drop-down button is included next to the buttons, we also want to add another if check with the same condition as before. If we have enough width, we want to render something else we want to have this row here. Otherwise, if we have enough space, we want to render a different row. And in this different row here, we don't want to have the drop-down button. Instead there, we just want to have the other buttons. So we could grab this spacer and then these buttons and move those here into this list. So with that, if we force a restart, this is how this modal could look like if we are in landscape mode. If I go back to portrait mode, we got the old layout. And that is how you can create a dynamic layout with help of LayoutBuilder. Though, as mentioned before, in this scenario, where this new expense widget effectively does take up the entire screen anyways, we could have also simply used media query as we did in the expenses widget. But I also wanted to introduce you to LayoutBuilder, which can be very useful if you have a widget that should only care about its parent widget and not necessarily about the entire available screen size. Of course, also as mentioned before, here we have a lot of code duplication and copying, and this can make this code here quite hard to understand and read, since we have all that duplication. For that reason, you might want to actually outsource these different widgets, which are reused in different parts of the layout, into separate custom widgets. Here, I'll just keep it like this, but it is something to be aware of and to potentially improve. But with that, that is how you can use LayoutBuilder to also build a layout dynamically.